Lieutenant Commander John Matthews studied the mission roster with a hard expression, his jaw tightening as each name registered on the list. The desert air seeped through the tent walls, mixing with the tension that had already been building for hours. Outside, the low hum of generators and the distant thud of artillery echoed across the barren landscape. His SEAL team had been pinned down in a hostile city, trapped under relentless fire from enemy sharpshooters hidden inside a crumbling stone tower nearly 800 meters away. Every attempt to pull the team out had failed. Ammunition was running low. Men were bleeding, and time was bleeding out with them. John's radio crackled to life, the static hissing before the voice of command came through. They were sending sniper support, someone with the skill to clear out the enemy positions that had turned the streets into a death trap. For a brief moment, John felt relief. He expected to hear the name of one of the veteran marksmen he had worked with before, hardened men with reputations forged in battle. Instead, the name that came over the radio made him freeze. Staff Sergeant Emma Carter. John's eyes narrowed, and he spoke into the receiver with frustration cutting through the static. "You're sending me a girl? My men don't need target practice from some rookie who probably spends more time cleaning her nails than her rifle. We need a real shooter. This is life and death." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that carried disapproval but also finality. Command wasn't changing their decision. Emma Carter was the sniper they were sending. John tossed the mission roster back onto the table, muttering under his breath. To him, this was a disaster waiting to happen. 800 meters, narrow tower windows, crosswinds whipping through the maze of streets, heat shimmer rising from the scorched rooftops. Even the most seasoned snipers considered it nearly impossible. And now, instead of the hardened veteran he was expecting, he was supposed to trust a woman he'd never even heard of? It was madness. John pushed away from the table and stepped outside into the harsh sunlight. The desert heat clung to him instantly, beads of sweat forming beneath his helmet. Somewhere out there, his men were cornered, waiting for rescue. He thought about the wounded, about the operator who had already taken a round to the leg, and the one slowly bleeding from a shoulder wound. Their survival now rested on a sniper he hadn't asked for, a sniper he didn't trust. What John didn't know was that Emma Carter was sitting in a canvas tent on the other side of the base at that very moment, running a cloth over the barrel of her rifle with a calm steadiness that betrayed none of the doubt surrounding her. She wasn't thinking about proving herself to him. She was thinking about the mission, about the men whose lives were slipping away. But John couldn't see that. All he saw was risk. He remembered missions in the past, times when support had faltered, when hesitation or poor aim had cost lives. He couldn't afford another mistake like that. He paced along the gravel walkway outside the operations tent, his boots crunching with each step. In his mind, the order from command replayed like a cruel joke. Emma Carter, a name that meant nothing to him, but in a matter of hours might mean the difference between his men making it out alive or being zipped into body bags. John shook his head. No, this wasn't how elite operations were supposed to work. He had led men through firefights, hostage rescues, and missions where failure wasn't an option. He knew the caliber of people it took to survive those moments. And in his experience, those people didn't look like Emma Carter. Inside the command tent, officers moved with urgency, updating maps, relaying intel, and coordinating reinforcements. John returned to the table, scanning the layout of the enemy stronghold. He knew the geography by heart already. The stone tower that loomed above the alleys, the choke points that prevented ground rescue, the rooftops littered with gunfire scars. Every path toward his men ended in open ground under the enemy sniper's gaze. No helicopter could get close without being shredded. No ground convoy could move without taking casualties. All roads led back to one thing: the shot. That impossible shot from nearly a kilometer away. And Emma Carter was supposed to take it. John's doubts turned over in his mind, sharper than the desert wind cutting across the base. He wanted to storm into Robert Hayes' office, to demand that command send someone else, someone proven. But deep down, he knew the decision was final. The only thing left was to wait, to see whether this so-called sniper would rise to the occasion or crumble under pressure. He leaned over the map once more, tracing the likely angle of fire with his finger, imagining the path of the bullet, the millimeters of error that would mean death. The enemy was patient, disciplined, skilled. Whoever was up in that tower wasn't some amateur insurgent with a stolen rifle. This was someone who knew their craft. John sighed heavily, dragging a hand down his face. He didn't want to admit it, but his men's lives were already in Emma Carter's hands. And whether he liked it or not, she was all they had, out there in the desert heat. Two stories were about to collide, one of deep-seated doubt, the other of unshakable resolve. The impossible shot waited. And soon, John Matthews would learn that assumptions could be shattered as easily as stones struck by a bullet. Emma Carter sat cross-legged on the floor of her small quarters at Forward Operating Base Falcon, carefully field-stripping her rifle for the third time that day. Each movement was precise, almost ritualistic, as if the rifle itself was an extension of her own body. Her hands, calloused yet steady, worked without hesitation, sliding each component into place with the kind of muscle memory that came only after years of practice. Outside, the desert winds howled faintly, rattling the tent walls, but Emma barely noticed. She was thinking back, not to the war before her, but to the life behind her. Long before she ever wore a uniform, Emma Carter had been a ranch girl in the rugged wilderness of Montana. She grew up surrounded by wide valleys, jagged mountains, and endless skies that seemed to stretch beyond imagination. Life there was not gentle. Winters bit hard, and summers demanded backbreaking labor. But for Emma, those years were not a burden, they were a foundation. Her grandfather, Michael Carter, had been the first to place a rifle in her hands. A Korean War veteran with eyes that held both kindness and unspoken sorrow, Michael believed in teaching responsibility early. He never handed her a weapon as a toy. Instead, he explained the weight it carried, the finality of a bullet once released. "This," he told her as he set the rifle across her small lap when she was only 7, "is not about power. It's about patience, respect, and control." Michael would take her into the dense forests at dawn, when the mist still clung to the pines and elk tracks were fresh in the soil. He showed her how to read the wind by watching the sway of grass, how to control her breathing until even her heartbeat seemed to slow. He taught her that hunting was never about taking life for sport, but about balance, about understanding the fragility of existence and the responsibility that came with pulling the trigger. By 12, Emma could outshoot grown men who visited the ranch for guided hunts. Her father, William Carter, a respected hunting guide himself, realized his daughter possessed a gift. While others fumbled at targets, Emma placed shot after shot exactly where she wanted it. The recoil never shook her, the noise never startled her, and the stillness of waiting, something most children struggled with, came naturally to her. She seemed born to watch, to wait, to strike only when the moment was perfect. Her teenage years were spent traveling across the western states, competing in shooting competitions that tested both accuracy and discipline. She wasn't flashy. She didn't brag. She simply showed up, set her sights, and let the results speak. Judges, hunters, and even seasoned marksmen began to recognize her face. She carried herself with quiet confidence, never arrogance, but there was no mistaking the focus in her eyes when she peered through a scope. While other teenagers obsessed over high school dances and social circles, Emma's weekends were spent lying in the cold dirt of competition ranges, learning to ignore discomfort, to become invisible to distraction. Her father drove her across long highways in their beat-up truck, proud yet protective, knowing the world she was heading toward would not be easy. He warned her about the military life when she first spoke of enlisting at 19. He told her that skill alone would not protect her from judgment, that being a woman in combat would test her spirit as much as her aim. But Emma was undeterred. She wanted to serve, not because of glory or medals, but because she had grown up understanding that precision could save lives. She had watched her grandfather wrestle with the memories of war, the weight of decisions he carried long after he had returned home. She decided that if she was ever to carry that same weight, she would do it with a level of skill that left no room for doubt. At Fort Benning, her natural ability set her apart immediately. Instructors noticed the way she remained absolutely motionless for hours during training, unblinking, steady, as if time itself slowed around her. She could read wind like others read a book, adjust instinctively, and maintain composure even under intense pressure. But alongside admiration came skepticism, whispers in barracks halls, raised eyebrows in briefing rooms, comments that a woman didn't belong in such roles. Emma ignored them, at least on the surface. She reminded herself of her grandfather's lessons, that the hardest battles weren't fought against visible enemies, but against doubt, both from others and within oneself. She carried those words with her through each deployment, each mission, each stare that lingered too long on her instead of her weapon. Now, as she sat in her tent in Iraq, cleaning the rifle that had become her constant companion, she thought of those mornings on the ranch, of her grandfather's gravelly voice reminding her to let the world grow quiet before she squeezed the trigger, of her father's truck rattling down dirt roads, his voice encouraging her even as he worried about the battles she would one day face. Those lessons weren't memories. They were armor. They were the invisible scaffolding that held her steady in the chaos of war. And as Emma Carter prepared for the mission that would define her in ways even she couldn't yet imagine, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She was ready. The operations tent buzzed with low voices, the rustle of maps, and the steady crackle of radios. It was supposed to be just another mission briefing, but the atmosphere carried an edge of unease. Emma Carter sat quietly at the long table, her posture straight, her eyes calm, her rifle resting against the wall beside her. She wasn't there to speak. She was there to listen, to be ready. Yet she could feel the weight of every glance, every unspoken question. Lieutenant Commander John Matthews stood near the map, his hand resting on the table as he went over sniper assignments for the coming operation. He was a man who carried authority with every word, hardened by years of experience. But when his eyes drifted down to Emma's name on the roster, his expression shifted from focus to irritation. He looked directly at Colonel Robert Hayes, the base commander, and spoke as though Emma were invisible. "You're really going to put my men's lives in the hands of her? This isn't some diversity experiment. We need someone who can handle a firefight, not just paper targets on a training range." The words hung heavy in the room, sharper than any bullet. Emma felt heat rise in her chest, but her face remained expressionless. She had learned long ago that reacting emotionally only fed the doubt of others. Still, inside, the sting was undeniable. She had fought for every inch of respect in this uniform, and in a single breath, John Matthews had tried to strip it away. Robert Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between John and Emma. His voice carried the authority of commander, but also the edge of frustration. "Staff Sergeant Carter has the highest accuracy rating of any sniper in this region. 12 successful high-value missions, without incident. She is not here as a symbol. She is here because she's the best." John didn't relent. Accuracy in practice isn't the same as combat. When rounds are flying, when men are bleeding out, that's when you see what someone's really made of. "I don't need statistics. I need someone who's proven they can do it under fire." A few of his SEALs, standing near the back, nodded in agreement. They weren't whispering like the others. Their skepticism was clear, and it stung deeper than casual remarks in the barracks. These were elite operators, men whose lives depended on absolute trust in the people around them. If they doubted Emma, it wasn't just prejudice. It was a barrier to survival. Emma kept her eyes on the table, tracing invisible lines along the map with her gaze. She said nothing. Words would not convince men like John Matthews. Only actions could. She made a silent promise in that moment. Every dismissive look, every skeptical nod, every whispered comment, they would all remember her differently when the time came. That night, Emma sat alone in her quarters. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls as she disassembled her rifle once again, her hands moving with the precision of habit. The metallic click of each piece, sliding free, was steady, rhythmic, almost calming. But her mind was anything but calm. The briefing replayed in her head in fragments, the sharpness of John's voice, the silence that followed, the nods of agreement. She remembered the way her chest burned with humiliation, the way her throat tightened though she refused to let it show. She had survived years of these moments, and yet they never grew easier. Each dismissal felt like being pushed back to the starting line, forced to prove herself all over again. Her grandfather's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Michael Carter had always told her that the hardest part of being a sniper wasn't pulling the trigger. It was carrying the doubts of everyone around you while never losing confidence in yourself. She had nodded when he said it as a teenager, but only now did she truly understand the depth of those words. Emma looked down at the rifle components spread across the table. She ran her fingers along the stock, where a small piece of tape held a folded paper. Inside were tally marks, 12 lines, one for each life taken through her scope, each shot fired to protect others. Each mark was a story of survival, of lives saved because she had been steady when it mattered most. Yet somehow, in rooms like the one she had sat in earlier, those marks seemed invisible. She reassembled the rifle piece by piece, sliding the barrel into place, securing the scope, locking the bolt with a familiar click. The weapon was whole again, a reflection of herself, steady, reliable, unshaken. She stared at it for a long moment, her jaw tightening. The anger wasn't new, but it simmered quietly, like coals waiting for a breath of air. She thought of the patrols she had saved with Overwatch fire, the insurgent snipers she had silenced before they could take another life, the improvised explosives she had spotted before convoys rolled over them. She thought of the countless soldiers who owed their safety to her watchful eye. None of it seemed to matter when a new face looked at her and saw only her gender. Emma leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She knew better than to chase approval. Respect in war wasn't given. It was earned, often through fire. And when the next mission came, she would earn it again, not with words or arguments, but with a shot so precise that even the most stubborn skeptic would have nothing left to say. Somewhere outside, gunfire echoed faintly in the distance. The war raged on, uncaring of doubt or prejudice. And Emma Carter, steady as the mountains she had grown up in, prepared herself for the day when her rifle would answer every question. The radio came alive with static, followed by the voice of John Matthews. His words were clipped, urgent, the tone of a man holding desperation at bay. "We're pinned down. Multiple wounded. Ammunition's running dry. We need extraction now." Emma Carter stood in the operations tent, her eyes fixed on the tactical map spread across the table. Red markers indicated enemy positions. Blue markers showed the trap seal team. Between them loomed a centuries-old stone tower, its windows like dark, watching eyes. Enemy snipers had turned it into a fortress. At 800 meters, with crosswinds swirling through narrow alleys, the shot to silence them was nearly impossible. Attempts had already been made. Other snipers had tried repositioning, but every angle left too much exposure. Air support was ruled out. Too many civilians in the crowded streets below. Ground rescue was suicide. Every path funneled into the tower's deadly sightlines. Colonel Robert Hayes looked at Emma, his jaw set. "Staff Sergeant, you think you can make this shot?" Emma didn't answer right away. She studied the map, the elevation lines, the direction of wind currents. Numbers and calculations played silently in her mind. 800 meters wasn't a distance that frightened her. She had trained for that. The true challenge was threading a bullet through narrow windows, while accounting for shifting desert winds and the unbearable truth that one mistake would mean American deaths. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, sir. I can make it." Minutes later, Emma lay prone on the rooftop of a crumbling building, her M24 sniper rifle braced on sandbags scavenged by local soldiers. Sweat clung to her brow beneath her baseball cap as the late afternoon heat rose in shimmering waves. Through the scope, the world shrank to a circle of glass and shadow. She saw the faint flicker of muzzle flashes from the tower, each round keeping John Matthews and his men trapped in their crumbling refuge. Her heart beat steady, controlled. She inhaled, then exhaled slowly, letting the rhythm guide her body into stillness. This was not the war she had walked into hours earlier in a briefing room. This was the world her grandfather had prepared her for, the stillness of the hunt, the patience to wait until the world itself seemed to pause. The first shot cracked across the battlefield, the recoil pressing firmly into her shoulder. The round struck the stone frame inches from her target, chips of rock exploding outward. Inside the tower, the enemy sniper flinched, pulling back for a moment. Emma adjusted her scope by fractions, correcting for the tiny deviation caused by the shifting wind. Her breathing slowed again. The second shot roared. This time, silence followed. The muzzle flashes stopped. But there were more. A second sniper appeared in another window, his barrel extending toward the streets below. Emma didn't hesitate. She tracked the movement, her crosshairs holding steady as the man leaned forward. Another breath, another trigger squeeze. The shot landed clean. The figure collapsed backward, vanishing into shadow. Voices crackled in her earpiece. Window clear. That's two down. She didn't celebrate. There was no room for pride, only focus. A third sniper fired from the tower's far side, his round slamming into the wall inches from a SEAL crouching in cover. Emma shifted position, recalculating the wind's subtle push. Her trigger finger remained patient, not rushing even under the urgency of shouts over the radio. When the shot came, it was like lightning, swift, precise, final. Another window went dark. One by one, Emma eliminated them. Each round was an answer to doubt, each impact a reminder that skill was blind to gender. The battlefield, indifferent and cruel, acknowledged only results. And Emma delivered. 3 hours later, the rescue helicopter finally touched down at forward operating base Falcon, its blades slicing through the twilight air. John Matthews and his battered SEAL team emerged, uniforms torn, faces streaked with dirt and blood. Medics rushed to carry the critically wounded toward waiting transports. John walked across the landing zone, his boots dragging slightly with exhaustion. He spotted Emma near the perimeter, seated calmly as she cleaned her rifle, the same steady ritual she had performed countless times before. For a long moment, he said nothing. His earlier arrogance seemed hollow now, crushed beneath the reality that her shots had saved his men. At last, he stopped in front of her, clearing his throat. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Completely wrong. You didn't just take a shot. You saved every man out there, including me." Emma glanced up only briefly, her expression unreadable. She didn't need his apology, but she accepted the respect it carried. With a small nod, she returned to her task, sliding a cloth along the rifle barrel. The story of the impossible shot spread quickly. Across the region, teams whispered about the Montana sniper who had silenced a tower full of enemy marksmen and saved an elite unit from certain death. Requests began flooding command. "Send Carter." But for Emma, the true victory wasn't recognition. It was the quiet knowledge that when the war demanded everything, she had answered without hesitation. The rifle in her hands was not just steel and wood, it was proof. Proof of patience, precision, and the lessons her grandfather had etched into her soul years ago on a ranch beneath the endless Montana sky. The desert night was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural after the chaos of combat. At forward operating base Falcon, the air carried the faint scent of fuel and dust, while the low rumble of generators broke the stillness. Emma Carter sat alone beneath a canopy, her rifle laid across her lap. She cleaned it carefully, piece by piece, though the weapon was already spotless. The ritual wasn't about necessity anymore. It was about grounding herself after what had been the most defining moment of her career. Word of the impossible shots had spread faster than she ever could have imagined. Within hours, messages rippled through special operations channels across the region. SEALs, Rangers, Delta operators, all of them had heard about the woman who had silenced the tower. No one called it luck. They called it skill. Teams began requesting her by name. "Send Carter," the orders read. Not a sniper, not support. Just Carter. For Emma, the sudden change was surreal. Officers who once avoided eye contact in briefings now invited her to weigh in on tactics. Soldiers who had whispered doubts now asked her about wind calls and scope adjustments. Respect had not arrived with ceremony or speeches. It came in the subtle ways men began to look at her differently, no longer with skepticism, but with acknowledgement. John Matthews, too, was changed. The arrogance that once coated his words was gone, replaced with something rare for him: humility. After the extraction, he had sought her out, admitted his mistake, and though his apology had been brief, it had been genuine. In the days that followed, he made a point of including her in mission planning, listening to her insights with the same weight he gave his most trusted lieutenants. Emma did not gloat. She didn't need to. Respect had finally been earned in the only language the battlefield respected: results. But recognition came with its own weight. Late at night, when the camp quieted and the desert wind swept through the tents, Emma would sit in silence and think about the shots she had taken. Each tally mark on the folded paper taped to her rifle stock represented a moment of life and death. She didn't celebrate them. She didn't glorify them. She remembered her grandfather's words. Pulling the trigger was not the hardest part. Carrying it afterward was. 6 months later, her deployment ended. She boarded the military transport back to the United States with little fanfare, just another soldier rotating home. Yet tucked in her pack were commendations from multiple commanders, each praising her precision and courage. The paperwork meant less to her than the quiet nods she had received from men like John Matthews, warriors who now trusted her without question. When Emma returned to Montana, the white skies and endless fields greeted her like an old friend. The ranch hadn't changed much. The worn wooden porch where her grandfather once sat, the fields where she had learned to track elk, the quiet ridges where dawn hunts had shaped her patience. Michael Carter was gone now, but his lessons lived on in her. One evening, she walked out to the porch with her rifle slung across her shoulder, the mountains glowing gold in the fading light. She sat in the same chair where her grandfather had once spoken about responsibility. Closing her eyes, she could almost hear his voice. "The world will doubt you, Emma. But the world doesn't pull your trigger, you do." Her father, William, joined her on the porch. He didn't ask for stories of the war, though his eyes carried the curiosity of a man who wanted to know. Instead, he simply said, "I heard what you did out there. I'm proud of you." Emma nodded, her throat tightening slightly. Praise was rare from her father, but when it came, it carried more weight than medals. In the months that followed, Emma tried to live quietly, but the stories of her time overseas followed her home. Veterans reached out to thank her. Young women wrote letters saying her story inspired them to chase their own dreams, even in places where others doubted them. Emma replied when she could, her words always humble, reminding them that skill came from patience, and respect was earned only through persistence. Yet deep inside, Emma knew her legacy wasn't about the tower or the impossible shots. It wasn't about silencing skeptics or proving herself to John Matthews. Her legacy was simpler. It was about the men who made it home because she had been steady when they needed her most. It was about carrying the responsibility of her choices, the weight of lives taken so that others could live. On the ranch, under the endless Montana sky, Emma Carter finally allowed herself a rare smile. She had faced doubt, humiliation, and prejudice. She had been tested in ways that could have broken her spirit. And yet, through patience, precision, and quiet determination, she had earned something greater than medals or recognition. She had earned respect. And in the stillness of the fading day, rifle across her knees, Emma understood what her grandfather had meant all along. Being a sniper was never about the shot. It was about the person behind it, and the resolve to stand steady when the world doubted you most.